Okay, today I'm going to talk about using a limited palette to paint a couple small still lifes, which I'll show in future videos. With limited palette, I'm talking about just using 3 colors plus black and white. I'm going to use red, yellow, and blue. And the colors that I'm going to pick for my limited palette today are Grumbacher red, which is a naphthol, it's a pure red, cadmium yellow medium, which is a pure yellow, and ultramarine blue, which is almost a pure blue. It's got a little bit of red in it. And then there's other palettes you can pick to do this. You can pick cadmium red light, yellow ochre, and ivory black. That's called the Zorn palette. That's a dull palette. And then you could pick English red, raw sienna, and cobalt blue. In every case, I'm picking a red, yellow, and a blue plus black and white. And if I do this, let me just show you what I get. Okay, this is what I'm going to show you is essentially a color chart that I made up using essentially these 3 colors plus black and white. So here's my red, here's my yellow, and my blue. And if I mix, these are the primary colors known as the primaries. If I mix the red with the yellow, I get an orange. If I mix the yellow with the blue, I get a green. If I mix the blue with a red, I get a purple. And then if I add white, what I'm doing is adding white to each one of these columns. You can actually see that I get a whole spectrum of lighter colors with different values, or value means tone or lighter, the lightness or darkness of the color. The column down here, I have the same set of both primary colors, the secondaries, which are orange, green, and purple, and then I have the tertiary colors, which are made with a primary and a secondary, and it's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, blue, purple, and purple, red. I have the same line down here, and here I've added black to these to darken them, except for the orange and the yellows. And the reason I'm not adding black to the orange and the yellows to make them darker is because the black I'm using is ivory black. It contains a blue. So if I added it to yellow, I would get a dull green, not a dull yellow. If I added it to the orange, which is the complement, I would get something that's dull and goes towards the brown. Now, speaking of complements, if I add red, yellow, and blue together, what I get is this color here. It's basically a muddy brown. If I take red and add a little bit of green, which is essentially directly opposite on the color wheel, which is a complement, I get a duller, darker red. Same thing with yellow. If I take yellow, add a little bit of purple, which is its complement, I get a yellow, which is basically going towards a duller, basically darker yellow. If I take, and it's this color down here, if I take blue and I add a little bit of orange to it, which is its complement, I basically get a duller, darker purple, duller, darker blue. I could basically go the other way. I could take orange and add a little bit of blue to it, and I'd get a duller orange. I could take green, add a little bit of red to it, I get a duller, darker green. I could take purple and a little bit of yellow to it, and I get a duller, darker purple. So I can essentially go the other way with the secondaries. Just for reference, let me show you what a color wheel looks like. This is a color wheel, and you can actually see on the color wheel, if I look at the opposite on the color wheel, that's the complement. So blue, orange, violet, yellow, the violet's the purple, the red, green, and I've got the tertiaries, the colors in between, and they show the complements too. You can purchase one of these at any art supply store. Okay, so now the next thing I'm going to talk about. So we've talked about essentially the spectrum of the color wheel: red, yellow, blue. Then the secondaries: green, orange, green, purple. The tertiaries. And then we talked about complementary colors to reduce intensity and make the color darker. It's a red, green, a yellow, purple, and an orange, blue. And then we talked about mixing all 3 primaries together, red, yellow, and blue, which gives you a brown. Notice with the complements, in every case, although I'm adding a little bit of green to red, I'm actually mixing all three of the primaries because the green contains blue and yellow. The same with the yellow-purple complement combination. The purple contains both red and blue, so again I'm mixing the three primaries together, and the same with orange and blue. So the next thing we're going to talk about is what I have in these far columns, which I haven't included in my color chart for the primaries, secondaries, and tertiaries. And these are other colors that I use. And I use these because they're inexpensive and cheaper than anytime I have to mix a cadmium color in with other colors. Cadmiums are very expensive and they're toxic. So I would try to avoid the cadmiums by essentially using colors that are relatively inexpensive and not toxic. So for instance, for browns, I can use burnt sienna, and you can see I can mix that brown, but it's much cheaper just to buy it, and I use a lot of it. Same with yellow ochre. I can mix it, but again, it's much cheaper, and it's something that I use a lot of. Cadmium red light, I'm showing that here. Again, I could mix it. Again, it's an expensive color. I use a lot of it because I'm a figurative painter, and it's easier for me to make flesh tones with cadmium red light. Yellow ochre and white would give me a really good flesh tone. And down here is alizarin crimson, which I use sparingly, and again it's a dark red, which I could have mixed with the Grumbacher red and black. Again, it's relatively inexpensive, and again I use a little bit of it, but it's a good color to have. Now, the next thing you see, these are colors I use frequently, UF. Again, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, cadmium red light, alizarin crimson. Now, there's colors that I seldom use, and that's over in this column. They're the phthalo colors: phthalo blue, phthalo green, phthalo yellow green. And I've also added burnt umber to this, which again is a brown that I could mix, really inexpensive. Don't use it much because I usually use burnt sienna and just put more black in it to make it towards a burnt umber. But the cadmium greens are very bright greens, which really aren't found in nature, but you find them in clothing. So if you're a figurative painter and you paint people with bright clothes on, you may use some of these. So I use these very sparingly. Now, there's colors that I very seldom use, and that would be, again, the seldom used colors are phthalo blue, phthalo green, phthalo yellow green, and burnt umber. Colors that I rarely use, but I do keep some on my palette are lemon yellow, raw sienna, cobalt blue, and raw umber. These I rarely, if ever, use these. Now I'm down my last column, which is this far column over here, are mixed blacks. The first black is basically ivory black, which is a blue black, but I can mix that with ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, gives me a nice black. That's the second one. Also phthalo green and alizarin crimson gives me a nice black. Again, and then burnt umber and purple also gives me a nice black. Now, typically when I mix a black, if I use a black, you mix it with burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, or I just use ivory black out of the tube. Now, a lot of the Impressionists back in the old days hated black. They never used it. I don't see any problem with it. I use it all the time. And like I said, if you want to mix it, you can mix it from ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. The ultramarine blue is more expensive. The ivory black is basically very, very inexpensive. So the idea is that if you're going to substitute mixing certain colors, get their cheaper versions, which are particularly which would be the umbers, the siennas. These are good substitutes for browns and yellows. The last thing I'm going to talk about, which I need to, even though I'm going to do some small alla prima paintings, which I'm going to paint all at once, the most important thing in any painting is actually the tone or the value, which is, well, how light or how dark things are. Color makes up about 10% of the painting, and the value makes up the rest. And typically I'm going to do a small painting of an apple and a tangerine, and what you're going to see is I'm really going to function everything around these 6 values: the highlight, the midtones in the light, the turning edge where you actually start turning away from the light and going into shadow, midtones in the dark, the reflected light, which is coming from the surface that the apple or tangerine is sitting on, and the cast shadow, which is always the darkest dark in the painting. And I have these all labeled in this chart. And again, I'm going to actually mix my colors in terms of the lightness and darkness using the chart that I just showed you with all the different mixtures to get darker, for instance, for the tangerine, darker oranges. As I go into shadow, I'm going to actually have to add some of the complement to the darker orange to get it to dull down. The cast shadow, it depends on what it's going to be on, a white cloth with some yellow in it. So the cast shadow, typically you'd have put a little bit of complement in it, which would be purple. And I'll go through all this when I do these smaller alla prima paintings of a tangerine and a tangerine and an apple. But this gives you an idea how you can actually mix a lot of colors using very few inexpensive colors, except for the cadmiums, and get a wide spectrum of colors to do anything you want. You really don't have to buy 12, 15, 20 different tubes of paint to match these colors. You just have to learn how to mix colors.